Welcome back. This is PyromaniacMo coming at you for another sit down and chat, getting down to some fantasy football goo. As always, you can find me at pyromaniac.com. I'm tweeting at PyromaniacMo, PYROMANIACMO. And on the Pyro site right now, of course, we have the podcasts going all the time. We've got the top 70 wide receivers up right now. We're doing the videos so you can see even behind the curtain a little bit more. We've got the draft kit that comes out, and just as a reminder, you can always sign up for the draft kit, and you're going to get every installment that we get emailed to you right away. So we are gearing up for the season. Today, I am lucky enough to have Mike Clay sitting down with me. Mike can be found on Twitter at Mike Clay NFL. He is Pro Football Focus Director, Managing Editor. He is ESPN Insider, Roto World contributor, Fantasy Sports Writers of America Hall of Fame voter. I feel like we could spend the whole time just going over your accolades, sir. How are you?
I'm pretty good. Yeah, I certainly keep busy, but now it's that time of the year. Now we're working on the draft guide, and of course the NFL draft coverage, that comes next week. So yeah, it's a busy time of the year. It's not just in season for us football people, as I'm sure you know. We're working year round.
Yeah, it is a long grind. That's to be sure. Pro Football Focus is just a fantastic site. We're trying to knock down some walls here by doing these interviews and introducing our fans to some other tools out there. Tell us a little bit about Pro Football Focus. What separates you guys from the other sites out there?
Well, I think it's really just the truly original content and stats that we have at the site. We have a great team of guys here who watches every single player on every single play of every game. That's pretty much the site tagline. It is the site tagline. And, it allows us to, look at aspects of the game you can't find anywhere else. What kind of routes are players running? At what distance downfield are wide receivers running when they're targeted? How often are players targeted while in the end zone? I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit later. That's something I rely on heavily. All kinds of things like that, snap numbers, routes, and stuff like that really gives you a better perspective on offensive schemes, on how good players really are. And now with College Football Focus, we're doing the same thing at the college level. Will give us an advantage in terms of our fantasy advice because we have more data on these players from the college level.
Yeah, you guys have a wealth of material out there. One ranking that I think is pretty hardcore that I'd like you to touch on is the elusiveness ranking. First of all, maybe talk about what is the elusiveness ranking and how might that be utilized in terms of fantasy?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's just another one of the statistics we have available, something we chart and calculate. And this is put together by the analysts at PFF that chart the games. And it's just a way to determine which players, force missed tackles, break tackles, that kind of thing. It's something that you can sort of see when you watch the games, but, we're charting this on every single play. And at the end of the day, a lot of the usual suspects show up. I mean, last year, Marshawn Lynch, Eddie Lacy, Jamal Charles, Le'Veon Bell, Arian Foster, DeMarco Murray, they were among the top backs in the category. And throw a kind of a surprise in there. Chris Ivory fits in there. He's a guy I always like. I think he was one of the guys when he was in New Orleans. Everybody loved him as kind of an underrated player and wanted to free Chris Ivory, as you will. And he finally went to the Jets. Now nobody seems to like him anymore, which is quite odd. I think he is an underrated talent, despite some yards per carry struggles the last couple of years. But we'll see. Kind of a fun spread offense up there with Chan Gailey now in New York. So we'll see if he gets a shot to really thrive in that offense.
Yeah, we'll get into some guys. I like Chris Ivory. I believe Paul Chargian refers to him as Beast East. It'll be interesting now with Ridley on the team. I'm kind of thinking they're going to go with one or the other. We'll see how it pans out. But before we dive in too deep, one thing we like to do at Pyro is sort of pull back the curtain, show fans, what resources that we use. So what's something that you yourself use as a go-to resource?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I try and this is, often, as you might imagine, a lot of people ask me, for advice if you're looking to get into the industry, if you want to work your way up. And one of those is creating original content. So I'll admit, I do stay in-house for a majority of it, especially because we do chart our own games and we have all the data we need and then some. So I have that advantage. But one thing I do really read religiously is the Roto World news feed. I think the guys that do that feed, Pat, Adam, Nick, and of course Evan over there, do a tremendous job with that. I think that's a great resource. I mean, obviously they put their fantasy spin on it. You have to take the information and put your own spin and really understand the information. But in terms of keeping up with fantasy relevant news, I think that's really the place to go. If I needed to buy another subscription, it would be to ESPN Insider, which I know you said once I'm not affiliated with, but that I do write for Insider, but the other content in there for the NFL coverage from the insiders of the 32 NFL teams, and of course the fantasy guys there as well, do a tremendous job. I love that Insider subscription. I think it's well worth it.
Yeah, I'm an insider. I got the Roto World app, so it's fantastic suggestions. So let's get down to it, Mike. Wide receivers. Although we both have Dez, you've got him ranked in your top 5. Pyro does as well. You and I were recently going back and forth on Twitter, and this is, perhaps a bit frivolous. We're both talking top 5 here, so we're maybe splitting hairs, but mainly you're feeling there may be a regression coming. And while I'll concede that he is very touchdown dependent. Now, Pyromaniac, just to plug the draft kit one more time, we've got 22 tabs. One of them is the touchdown dependency chart. Dez was 42.1% of his fantasy value came from touchdowns. Torrey Smith was the only one a little bit higher. Now, that said, Dez Bryant, touchdowns have risen every single year since he's been in the league. He's gone for over 1,000 yards in the last 3 seasons. He's led the Cowboys in targets for the last 2 years, led them in touchdowns for the last 3, saw 8 targets inside the opposing 5-yard line, second most in the NFL, scored 5 out of those times. And I don't know, I'm thinking with the departure of DeMarco Murray, there's going to be some space to fill. What's the flip side of that argument? Why are you expecting a regression with Dez?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, I still like him. I think he's a top 5 option. Obviously, a tremendous talent, still in his prime, an offense that scores a lot of points. He's a good quarterback. They don't have it. Probably a little overlooked is the fact that they don't have a ton of offensive weapons, especially after Murray left. They have Whitney's getting up there in age, probably still a reliable target, but not a big playmaker. And Terrence Williams, he's fading away. They don't really like him. He's also a regression candidate in the touchdown department. They relied heavily on Cole Beasley down the stretch. They really need to. Frankly, it wouldn't surprise me. Nobody's talking about it, but it wouldn't surprise me if they did add a wide receiver in the draft. All that being said, in NFL history, if a player who has scored 16-plus touchdowns in a season has never matched that the next year, so you can pretty much guarantee he's not going to score 16 touchdowns again. I think it's fair to put him in that 10 to 12 range. I mean, that may seem like a large drop, but it's still a big number for the NFL. Scoring almost a touchdown a game, 10 to 12, that's a lot of touchdowns. I think that is probably where he lands. I have his projection very close to Jordy Nelson. They're almost identical. I think that's where he belongs. You have to remember, as efficient as that offense was last year, as good as they were, they are a run-heavy offense. They're going to try and continue to do that regardless of who is in the backfield. It worked so well last year. They're not just going to throw that away. So, that definitely limits the offense a little bit. But again, the efficiency is there to allow a top 5 season. I just don't think, if you're ranking him ahead of guys like Demaryius Thomas or especially a guy like Antonio Brown, I think you're playing with fire there.
And again, it perhaps is moot. We both have him very highly rated. You just put out one of the plethora of articles on Pro Football Focus. Was your 2015 wide receiver rankings, of course, pre-draft, of course. The top end of the spectrum, honestly, was very similar to what Pyro has in our first version of the draft kit. One thing stuck out to me, though, was Golden Tate. Now, where he is in our draft kit, that's going to change, especially after the NFL draft. But basically, we've got him as wide receiver 2. You didn't have him quite so high. In our draft kit, you'll find him with in a tier with Hopkins and Benjamin Matthews, guys like that. You've got him sort of tiered with Floyd and Fitzgerald. To do the pro Golden Tate argument, I think he's trending the right way. In each of the years he's been in the league, statistically, he's surpassed the year before in targets, receptions, yards. And the touchdown dependency that I mentioned earlier, the top 35 wide receivers, no other player was less touchdown dependent. Only 15%. 15% of his value came from touchdowns. He only had 4. I think he's going to increase on that. How come you don't have Golden as a wide receiver number 2?
Well, I mean, first of all, you have to look at the Detroit offense. They took a major step back last year. They were in the bottom third of the league in touchdowns. I don't think much of Matthew Stafford. In fact, dynasty league today, I traded Stafford straight up for Teddy Bridgewater. I just don't think. I think Stafford's been heavily reliant on Calvin Johnson. That concerns me, and I just wonder if that offense is really going to turn the corner. I feel like Stafford probably still a little overrated by the masses. The other big thing is you have to remember Calvin Johnson missed basically 4 of 12 games. He was basically a decoy in the games he played of those other 4. In those 4 games, Golden Tate was fantasy's number 3 wide receiver. In the other 12 games, he was 31st. So, I mean, if you think Johnson's going to play every game and you don't expect Detroit to just, magically flip a switch and be very good, which they were not at all last year, then I just can't see Tate fitting in as a top 15 or so fantasy receiver. I have him more as a borderline 3. And another thing is, I mean, if you're one of the people that thinks a lot of Eric Ebron, you think he's going to, be a borderline tight end 1, that's another reason not to like Tate. So you kind of have to, see what's available in that offense and kind of go from there. But, I think if you figure Johnson plays 15, 16 games, Tate just is not going to come anywhere close to where he was last year.
And see, I'm of the belief that I don't think Johnson is going to be putting up a full slate this year. And, you can look at Golden's numbers and pretty much guess right in the middle of the season. That's when he has all those 100-yard games, and that's indeed when Johnson was out. So they're going to have to find a way to play nicely together, I suppose, if he's going to have some success in fantasy. On March 3rd, you put out a fantastic article on Pro Football Focus, touchdown receptions, size matters. Now, this topic was broached when I interviewed Matt Harrison a while back, and John Tuvey even to some extent when I was talking to him. Explain the impetus behind this article that size matters.
Well, I mean, this was sort of a reaction article. I mean, this is a pretty popular topic, certainly on fantasy football Twitter, if you will. A lot of people like to talk about this debate. But there was an article out that said that size was basically irrelevant, and it's just not true. I mean, so, the argument that I'm making essentially is that it does matter. It's pretty much that straightforward. I think a lot of people know that, but I was putting it statistically. And what I kind of discovered here was that, a lot of people say, okay, bigger players have a better touchdown rate when targeted in the red zone. I kind of got rid of that. I think that's very flawed, because what you see is that, and I'm kind of foreshadowing here because I know you're going to ask about this. Bigger players have higher average depth of targets in the red zone. Smaller players have lower ones. It's just it's the same as is the case throughout the field. What the point is that, if you're just using red zone data, a guy targeted on a screen at the 19-yard line, that's counted the same way. That's counted as a red zone target the same way that a throw to the end zone is counted, or a slant from the 1-yard line. So I try and get away from that, and I look at every single target and to see what the odds of a touchdown are based on size and weight. And you do see that coaches rely more heavily on players as they get taller. The taller the player, the more likely they are to be targeted near the end zone. And the research also shows that it doesn't necessarily mean that height means you're better at scoring touchdowns. I think touchdowns more about opportunity, really. But that doesn't really matter. I mean, you could be the best touchdown scorer in the league at 5'10", but it doesn't really matter if you're not getting the targets. If there's a player who's decent at scoring touchdowns, but he's 6'4", and the coach keeps calling targets for him at the end zone, he's gonna outscore that first player in touchdown. So that's kind of what my research showed, and I think it's pretty telling.
God, my wife has been reassuring me that size doesn't matter, but nevertheless, knowing what you know, and honestly, that's one of the reasons I'm a little skeptical of ODB 5'11". I still think it'd be fantastic, but I'm a believer in the article size matters. So knowing what you know after doing your research, what's the optimal height and weight for a guy?
Well, I mean, I'll say this first of all about Odell Beckham, who he likes to be called OBJ, by the way. That's his preference, so we'll call him that. He was up there in end zone targets last year. He was targeted at the end zone a lot. So, there are going to be exceptions once in a while, but I agree with you. That is somewhat of a concern, especially with Larry Donnell, Ruben Randall there. Corey Washington, I think he's still a pretty nice deep sleeper to watch, and he has a ton of size as well. You could see him drop off in touchdowns. I do have him dropping off in touchdowns. I think he'll be more in the 8 to 10 range. He had 12 last year. So I somewhat agree there, but there could always be a change. You could see coaches start calling more plays for these smaller receivers. We'll see what happens there. And in terms of optimal size, I don't think this study really says there's an optimal size. It just says, I basically started at 5'9", 5'10", and worked my way up to 6'4", 6'5", and you just see a progressive increase in usage as you get taller. So I don't think you could say, okay, this guy's 6'1", that's the perfect guy to go for. And I don't think you should just draft every 6'5" player like a Dorial Green-Beckham. This doesn't automatically make him, don't take him number 1 overall because he's going to score 10 touchdowns a year. There's more to it than that. But you can bet, though, if you're talking about a guy like Green-Beckham or a guy like Philip Dorsett, Dorsett's not going to get near the usage near the goal line that Dorial Green-Beckham is. It's just that simple. So if you're taking Dorsett, I think he scored 10 touchdowns last year at college. In college, he's not going to do that in the pros. You just can't expect that sort of touchdown production because he's not going to get those high value targets.
So, how much should how much do you weigh that? Like, for example, we're a big believer in tiers. In fact, on DraftKit version 2, my tiers will be in there. Now, is this something like you're not going to draft a guy who's 5'10" and below, or is this kind of a tiebreaker? If you're going between two guys, you might take the taller guy. How much do you weight this factor?
Well, I think and that's the argument that you get back a lot of times when you make this argument is that, well, that's just another, another category, what are you breaking ties with it? Or is it important? How important is it? But really, it is just another category like you would consider everything else. You consider, I don't want to say 40 time per se, but, speed, height, a player's weight, how good their hands are. Are they going to drop a lot of passes? Are they're going to be involved as a returner, which could cost them snaps? Are they going to play in the slot? Are they going to play outside? How much raw talent do they have? And you consider all of these categories, and then you make your evaluation, you rank your players, and you go from there. I mean, Amari Cooper, he's not quite as big as Kevin White, but Cooper can do pretty much everything. He's a tremendous player. He's good hands. He has good speed. There's a lot to like, and that's probably why he goes ahead of White, who's faster, who's bigger, who has more weight on him, that kind of thing. So. I think it's just a factor you consider. I think where maybe it has a little more value is maybe in a standard league, week 8, you're on waivers, you're looking for a bye week replacement at wide receiver, and maybe you consider it's a deep league. You're considering two guys who maybe you won't get a ton of work, a ton of targets, but maybe you take the 6'4" guy over the 5'9" guy because, hey, there's a better chance this guy scores a touchdown. It kind of boosts his projected point total. So that's really how I work it in. I'm a big projection guy. We do the projections for Yahoo. We're doing ESPN this year, RT Sports, a bunch of sites. So, all that stuff sort of gets worked into our projection model, and certainly size. Guys with more size have a better chance of, scoring higher in the projected touchdown department.
Yeah, that's the thing. I get asked all the time. How much does certain things factor in to your tiers? And I just, I'm a stat head. I love the dead, the fish. I can tell you, how many times a song was played at Deer Creek and whatnot. But that's the same thing with these stats. Like you said, it can be a great predictor or a determining factor if you're going between two guys on the waiver wire, or if indeed draft comes around to you and it's kind of going between two guys and you're deciding which guy to put up higher in your tiers. I think some of these significant stats, that's going to be the tiebreaker, and it's just uncovering the right ones and finding out which ones you like. Now, your research uncovered something pretty interesting. The average depth of target. Can you explain the concept of this and what can a stat head do with it?
Yeah, well, in terms of the context of this article, it really is what I discussed before, which is that, when and really the only point of this article where I mentioned this is when talking about red zone data. So, of course, the bigger players are scoring more often because when they're in the red zone, they're being targeted further downfield. Their catch rate's lower, their depth of target's up. Obviously, those things correlate well. The farther you are away from the quarterback, the lower your depth of target is. And that's the case not just in the red zone, but on the entire field. So average depth of target, I mean, what do we usually use when you're projecting yards or looking at yards? Yards per reception. You're basically eliminating 40-some% of all the targets in the league from your sample size to do that, to figure out a player's role. If a guy catches a slant and goes, 80 yards for a touchdown in week 1, his yards per reception then is inflated for almost the rest of the season, even if that's a player that plays near the line of scrimmage. Remember, Wes Welker caught a 99-yard touchdown a couple of years ago. I remember Tim Hightower catching an 80-yard screen a couple of years ago, so that kind of thing. Average depth of target, it's a larger sample, it's more predictable, and it really shows you what sort of role a player plays, and it's just a better way to really predict these stats like yardage.
So essentially, let's say you got player A and player B, and you're looking at red zone statistics, and they've both got 20 targets in the red zone. The depth of target, that's going to reveal to me, I want the guy that's not catching the screen pass, but I want the guy that's running the corner route. Is this right?
Yeah, I mean, again, and you want to weigh everything, not just red zone, not just in the red zone, but you want to consider total. I mean, if it's 20-20, the guy, the shorter guy is probably going to be a little bit better in PPR. Of course, he's going to catch a higher percentage of his targets. The other guy is going to be better in standard because he has a better opportunity to score touchdowns. So that's the basic concept, but we could probably spend, a couple hours just discussing the implications of this. But again, you just consider that for every single player, how often they're targeted, where those target locations are, and the number of end zone targets, or, all that kind of stuff adds up. And at the end of the day, that's the best way to really come up with a player evaluation.
For the stat heads out there, I think something along those same lines, especially with Does Size Matter, your colleague Michael Moore recently posted the running back cliff, very similar to the height weight predictor. According to him, 29 is the cliff. This is when production falls off. Do you feel that's accurate for a running back?
Well, I mean, I didn't check his work per se. He did a lot of the legwork on this, but I mean, I think without really getting too into detail, I would say it's probably about right. I mean, I think a lot of us have that kind of common knowledge that that's when players start to decline. I mean, you just look at the players he referred to in the study. Matt Forte, Marshawn Lynch, Arian Foster are the players who are in that age range now. You could probably throw Adrian Peterson in there as well. Really the one that stands out is Matt Forte. I mean, he's been number 1 in snaps among running backs each of the last 2 years. Last year, and I just did another study on the effect of defensive packages on yards per carry. We saw that Matt Forte last year actually saw a lot more nickel. Technically his yards per carry number should have risen last year. He should have been a lot more effective. The opposite happened. He dropped down to his lowest yards per carry in a long time. He, frankly, he just was not very good as a runner last year. And you could blame some of that on blocking. I'm fine with that. But at the same time, we're seeing a decline from him. And you're going to see a drop in targets from him this year as well, with Mark Trestman gone. So, I think with a guy like Forte, who's just been so heavily overused and closing on an age 30, I think that, that's a guy I'm not going to have on any dynasty teams. I will be selling him. He sells a ton of name value this offseason. I think he's the guy you want to get rid of. And, I'm shopping Lynch too. I think he maybe has a year left after they re-signed him, in that run-heavy Seattle offense. And Foster, I think he's a little undervalued just because he gets hurt so often, but he's terrific too. But I think Forte is the one that, there should definitely be, that proverbial red flag on.
Yeah, we're Pyromaniacs based out of Chicago. I definitely want to get to Forte, in particular, your article about the coaching changes and Kubiak leaving. Before we get there, though, while we're on the stats, one other thing that you discuss pretty heavily in your writing is the value of opportunity. What's the idea behind this? And again, how can fantasy football heads use that to their advantage?
Well, and again, I can keep this pretty quick because I talked about it before, but I think it doesn't really matter how big or impressive a player is. They have to get the high value targets in order to score touchdowns. And we saw that a guy like Andre Johnson's a good example, who just isn't getting those high value targets as often throughout his career, but especially recently. The quarterback play in Houston has just not been very good. So that's something you have to consider when you're trying to just determine how often players can score touchdowns. There are a few players who kind of stand out, might be better than others at scoring touchdowns. Dez Bryant, Rob Gronkowski, of course. Greg Jennings, probably an underrated one. He heads to Miami now. They need touchdown scorers. Maybe he's an underrated player this year. But then you look at a guy like Calvin Johnson. The guy just can't consistently put a ton of touchdowns together. It's easy to forget. But at times he just really struggles to find the end zone, and he's a great example of that, of why touchdowns, I think, are significantly more about opportunity than they are about player talent. Player talent gets you on the field, of course, gets you those opportunities, but not necessarily an indicator of the ability to find the end zone.
Well, speaking of opportunities and guys that the role have changed or new coaches come in or what have you, who do you like that will maybe see an increase in usage or a rise in targets this year?
Well, I'm not sure if we're going every position here, but I think, just running through them, I think Teddy Bridgewater's a quarterback. I mentioned him. I like him a lot. He was terrific last year on mid-range and deep throws. I think he's a borderline quarterback one at running back. I think you have to look at Carlos Hyde, Trey Mason. I think both of those are for increased workloads. Hyde was terrific last year in a limited role, almost matched Frank Gore and forced missed tackles, despite seeing, I think he had like 83 carries and Gore was over 200. At tight end position, there's quite a few there. You look at Hill in New Orleans replacing Jimmy Graham. We're starting to run out of players to potentially move ahead of him on the depth chart. I mean, we're going to have to start buying him as a top 15 tight end. Jason Morrow in the spread offense there in New York. Austin Seferian-Jenkins, already an every down player last year, but kept getting hurt. He's intriguing. And wide receiver, I think Martavis Bryant probably, locks himself in as that number 2 receiver. And Big Ben loves throwing to him near the end zone. And Pittsburgh, usually scores most of their touchdowns through the air. So I think Bryant's another one as well.
Well, let's get even jumping ahead of not just opportunity. And now you talked about Hyde. I'm not liking him so much this year. I don't know if he's going to be taking a quantum leap. I'm putting some interesting stuff in the pros and cons about him. And when he had double-digit carries, he just did not have good yards per carry. What are some guys that you think are either going to take a quantum leap forward in their usage, maybe because of changes on the team positionally or coaches, or maybe guys that may underperform, either one, going forward or going backward?
Well, I mean, I'll touch on Hyde quickly. I mean, first of all, I don't know that we really had the sample for the double-digit comparison there. I mean, he only had, I think it was 83 carries last year. But I mean, you watch the tape on him, you look at the numbers, there's a ton to like about him. I don't think he does a ton as a receiver. I think that might hurt him in PPR, but I like him a lot in standard leagues. I think he's a candidate to score 8 or 12 touchdowns, and I think he's just terrific. I mean, he explodes off the tape. He's a good hard-nosed runner. He just runs people over every carry. So I'm not with you there. We'll have to see how that goes, but I'm a big Carlos Hyde guy, so I definitely recommend investing there. I think I just talked about that running back study I did. I don't know if quantum leap's probably the word, but I'm really intrigued by Lamar Miller. He was quietly a borderline running back 1 last year. He doesn't get a ton of respect. It seems like he doesn't get it from his own team as they're, been sniffing around running backs in the offseason. But, he is outstanding. No player was better in terms of yard per carry against opposing base defenses last year. And he gets to run against nickel a lot because Miami likes their 3 wide set. So I think he's a really intriguing player. We'll see if he can take that next step forward. He's still pretty young. And again, I won't keep rolling on here because I did just talk about a few of those guys with Trey Mason, Martavis Bryant, those tight ends. Latavius Murray's probably the final one I'd really want to mention. I think that, again, they're another team sniffing around running backs, but if he gets a chance to be that number 1, I'm not worried about Trent Richardson. I think Halu's a good back, but more of a passing down complimentary guy. I think Murray has a ton of upside too. So he's a guy I would definitely buy into, if you will.
Yeah, good numbers there. I'm into Latavius Murray as well. Bryant. Going back to Hyde real quick, like you said, we don't have it's not a large sample size, but in games in which Hyde carried the rock more than 7 times, he averaged 2.85 fantasy points per game. And when he had double-digit carries, he averaged a paltry 2.67 yards per carry. But like you say, that it was only a handful of times in which he did that. Some things I'm interested in, you always hear podcasts and analysts talking about top 10 at a position. And chances are, in a draft, you're going to get a shot at one of those guys. But in all likelihood, once we get down to, wide receiver, running back, wide receiver 3 or 4, or even down further, that's where you might have a shot to take a couple more of those guys. So really, you should spend more time, I think, researching some of those guys, because you're going to have to pick from a couple, whereas the guys at the top, you're probably going to get one swing. So wide receivers, let me list some names for you. These are guys that are current ADP, which I know is going to change drastically, but guys just outside of the top 24 on Fantasy Pros, I believe I went to. And you might have hit some of these guys already, but who do you like out of this list here? Again, this is outside of wide receiver 2 currently. Martavis Bryant, Jarvis Landry, Michael Floyd, Torrey Smith, Eric Decker.
Out of those 5, I have Decker the highest. I'm buying on him as potentially outscoring Brandon Marshall. I think that too quickly Marshall was acquired and everyone said, okay, Marshall's the 1, Decker's the 2. I think what's overlooked is how good Decker was last year. He was terrific in a terrible offense. His numbers with Geno Smith are almost identical to what they were with Peyton Manning in terms of efficiency. Hard to believe, but I think Decker, he's younger. He was good last year. It's a new offense, but I think Marshall's getting up there a little bit. I think Decker's probably the 1A and Marshall the 1B. Either way, it's very close. But I think Decker is a back end wide receiver 2 there. And I like Landry as well. I think he's going to be a 90+ catch guy. Just worry about, is he going to get more downfield work? And I think he only had 2 targets near the end zone last year. That's a concern. I think the highest upside here, probably Martavis Bryant. The guy is a ton of touchdown upside. He could be a double-digit touchdown scorer. And, if he gets those every down snaps in that offense with Big Ben, I definitely think he's a guy that could be a big-time breakout guy in 2015.
You think and is Landry sweating at all now that they just signed Greg Jennings?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think Landry's not going to be a big touchdown guy anyway. I think he's going to be your prototypical, PPR stud, but he's going to struggle in the touchdown department throughout his career. I remember talking about that with Kendall Wright years ago, that being an issue, but I think Landry's a little better than him. And I think Landry is just going to be force-fed the ball this year. I do think he's a borderline wide receiver 2, even in standard leagues. And, I should probably touch on Mike Floyd too. I think he's a definitely a good bounce back candidate and undervalued. So a lot of interesting names on this list for sure.
Yeah, I think Floyd's really going to have nice value, good bounce back candidate. Rounding out my 10 that they picked, give me 1 or 2 you like. Allen Robinson, Andre Johnson, Charles Johnson, Mike Wallace, Kenny Stills.
Well, I have Johnson the highest at 20. I think in this Colts pass-heavy, high-scoring offense, there's a lot to love about him. And he's obviously going to be very motivated, having a chance to win the Super Bowl. I think Allen Robinson, highest ceiling. If Blake Bortles takes a step forward, I think that the sky's the limit for Robinson. I think there's a ton of talent there.
Moving on to running backs. Again, this would be running back outside the top 24 currently listed. I'm going to give you 5 names. Crowell, Spiller, McKinnon, Devontae Freeman, Frank Gore.
I'd say Gore, mid-pack running back 2 in that Colts offense. He's going to see more work as a receiver than we've seen in past years, plus get a lot of the goal line work there. So for me, he's number 1 on the list.
And then rounding out my running backs, the next 5, Shane Vereen, Bishop Sankey, Ryan Matthews, Doug Martin, Rashad Jennings.
This one's funny because I have them 32, 31, 33, 29, and Matthews a little deeper than that. But 4 of these 5 guys are right there next to each other. Right now, I have Jennings slightly higher. I'm interested to see how that develops. He wasn't very great last year. He got a lot of work at the goal line, which helped boost him a little bit. And Vereen's right there on passing downs. They may draft a running back. Who knows what they do there? Andre Williams, of course, wasn't very good, but I think there's a lot to be determined here. Frankly, I don't really like any of these guys. I'd really want to stay away from them all. I don't even think Martin's the top running back on Tampa, frankly.
Now that we've had some time to chat here, Mike, let me ask you a personal question, sir. Do you believe in streaming?
Sure. I mean, who's going to have an elite option at every position? I think you have to draft the best player you can, and if you end up at a position where there's no values when you're up, go ahead. I have no problem with that. I usually wait a quarterback, so I understand that philosophy. And tight end, if you don't get Gronkowski, I'll be waiting a long time this year.
Not Kelsey?
Not at his ADP. I mean, I think there's that tier where Kelsey is, with Graham and Bennett and those sort of guys, Gates. I think that and Greg Olson too is the other one. I think that you just wait for the last one left. I think Kelsey, he was, and everyone says this about Alex Smith, he doesn't throw deep. Well, I don't think people realize how much of that problem that was for Kelsey last year. His average depth of target was extremely low last year, but he was just terrific after the catch to a point that it's unsustainable. I mean, his numbers on a per catch basis will drop off this year. It's just going to happen. So I definitely have some concerns from there. From there, I think he's a top 5 guy, but I think that his ceiling's a little out of control right now, and at his ADP, probably a little too much.
Yeah, he's unfortunately becoming too popular for me. I wish that wasn't the case. Looking at rookies, though, the top 2 at the positions, you a Gurley or a Gordon man?
I'd probably say Gurley. I mean, I think he has that massive upside. I mean, it's kind of funny. I remember Trent Richardson being the next Adrian Peterson. Obviously, that didn't pan out, but I don't think that should scare anyone away from Gurley. He's obviously terrific on tape, and he's big. He has three down upside, and the ACL doesn't seem to be a concern. Guys come back from that all the time. So I'm all in. I think Gurley's the number 1 dynasty pick.
And the other one, wide receiver, the big 2, White or Cooper?
I'm going Cooper here. I'm sticking with my guys at PFF. I actually have White 3rd, Devontae Parker number 2. Cooper, again, it's hard because he's a little slower. He's smaller. You wonder about those kind of things. But, Cooper just so terrific all-around player. He just does it all. It has good hands, and he'll only improve as a blocker. So I think there's just too much to like there. I mean, I'm usually a wide receiver over running back guy. I'm not a big running back fan. In dynasty rankings, mine are always lower. But I think Gurley's terrific. He's worth that number 1 pick. But I have no problem if you go Cooper with that spot. That makes sense to me.
And any other rookies that you might be excited about in redraft or probably more like dynasty leagues? But any other names that you're liking?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting running backs. I mean, I think probably more interesting than the actual running backs is the fact that there's a bunch of teams that need a running back, like Atlanta, Arizona. Those 2 are probably the key ones. Dallas, of course, is in that mix as well. So that's really interesting to me. It really depends where these guys land. I mean, TJ Yeldon, if he ends up drafted by Atlanta, to go with Devonta Freeman, that makes him very interesting. He could score 7-8 touchdowns. It really depends where these guys go. I think Tevin Coleman's really an interesting guy on paper. He certainly stands out. I know there's some concerns about him, but I think he has 3 down upside. And I kind of hope he lands in a situation like Arizona where he's a chance to play a lot. But let's be honest, whoever goes to Dallas is going to just skyrocket up the rankings. Yeah. That's really the place to be this year.
Place to be for running backs. I did have a few more for Mr. Mike Clay. And can you hear me, sir?
Yep, I'm here.
All right. Blanked out there for a second. Certainly Dallas is the place to be. And it's going to be a hot ticket to the guy that lands there. You did bring up Arizona as being one of the teams needing a running back. Who is Ellington? Is he the 5.5 yards per carry guy we saw or the 3.3 from last year?
Well, I mean, and again, I covered him in that study I just did too. He performed pretty well last year, but this year he was just asked to do more work against base defenses. He didn't do very well. So, he's older than people realize too. I think he's just one of them guys that's going to settle in to a role very much like Gio Bernard in Cincinnati or not quite as severe, but sort of a Shane Vereen in New England. So I think that's going to kind of be his future role. They're going to look for a guy to handle the workload on early downs, a guy like a TJ Yeldon, for example, and have Ellington come in there on passing downs and give their lead back a breather on early down. So if they can find that like Jeremy Hill or Stephen Ridley type of runner in this draft, they don't have to go too early. They can go in round, maybe round 3 with a lot of depth at that position this year, and find a guy that they can form a committee with. And I think that backfield would be terrific. But Ellington's a guy I'm not going to be terribly high on him. I just don't think that he's going to be one of those guys that's out there for 3 downs. It's just he's not good enough to handle it.
I got about 5 more minutes here with you, Mike. One thing I wanted to bring up is a recent article of yours, breakdown 2015 offensive coaching changes. I did just tweet out a link to this. I'm at PyromaniacMo. He is at Mike Clay NFL. What transactions, as far as coaching, whether offensive coaches or offensive coordinators or head coaches, what transactions do you think are going to affect fantasy the most?
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of impact from the moves this year, and I can't, obviously we don't have time to get into everything, so I recommend checking out. I think there's some good stuff in there. But Chan Gailey going to the Jets, I mean, forget what you know about that offense. I mean, we're used to that Rex Ryan run heavy, slam it between the tackles type offense. It's going to be completely different now with Chan Gailey. He made Ryan Fitzpatrick look good. CJ Spiller had a great year up there. Stevie Johnson's best years were in that offense. He even made Scott Chandler relevant there for a while. So you look at that Jets offense, it's going to be spread out. I think they had a running back in the draft to help out on passing downs. Marshall, Decker, Amaro, and Curley split wide. That's going to be their base offense, so I'm really intrigued by that. Buffalo, Greg Roman goes there. Hey, how good Shady McCoy going to be in this offense? He was not very good last year against base defenses. He was one of the worst, actually. That's a concern as he goes to this Rex Ryan offense. He's going to have to run between the tackles. In Chicago, Forte, his targets are going to drop off. I do worry about his age and effectiveness, but I think that you can only project so many missed games for a guy. So even if you think he misses 2 or 3, he's going to play a lot when he's on the field. So it's hard not to like him a lot in PPR. Trestman in Baltimore, I don't think there's going to be much of an impact there. Forsett, maybe his targets go up a little bit. He was very good last year, one of the best in the league, most effective rushers. I don't think it makes much of an impact otherwise. I think, if anything, the schedule for Baltimore is the problem. They have a really hard schedule next year. And probably the other big one, Gary Kubiak goes to Denver. I love Cody Latimer. I've been buying on him in Dynasty, but I do worry about his playing time this year. I think Latimer owners, every year there's certain things people complain about. Last year, the famous one was complaining about Andy Reid not using Kelsey. This year, it's going to be people saying, why is Virgil Green running routes and Cody Latimer standing on the sideline? Or why is Owen Daniels out there, but Latimer's not? Kubiak loves 2 tight end sets, even on passing downs. It's going to be a problem for Latimer as their 3rd wide receiver. So I think that's the impact there. And, they're going to be balanced. They've been balanced. No big changes there. Because they usually lead in the second half. So I think Manning's upside a little capped. I think C.J. Anderson is, in fact, the man. I think I'm ready to buy on him. There should be some hesitation there because we don't know a lot about him. But I think that he's in a great situation to thrive and absolutely has that upside to be the number 1 overall fantasy running back this year.
Yeah, a couple points there. I think I got this info from you, but I recently just tweeted out about 3 wide receiver sets. Last year, the Broncos 7th most in the NFL with 3 wide, and I was excited about Latimer, but Kubiak last year, the Ravens ranked 30th in 3 wide receiver sets. So I am not nearly as excited about Latimer. And you're speaking to my heart because we got a guy at Pyro, I think Dog, he's kind of down on CJ Anderson, and I've been running the CJ Anderson camp. I've been tweeting out all kinds of stats about him, and I think he is indeed the man, as you say. Another guy I'm pulling for Set, so I really like Trestman coming there. He did wonders for Forte. I'd like to see what he's going to do for Set. Last question for you, sir. You've been great to give me your time again. Mike Clay, at Mike Clay NFL, Pro Football Focus Director, ESPN Insider. Give me 1 or 2 sleeper picks for this year.
Sleeper picks probably. I guess I mentioned Bridgewater. I think he's a guy worth taking a shot on. I do worry a little bit about the cold weather for him this year, so maybe I'm not as aggressive as I'd be if the dome was built. Like it or not, weather matters. If it's cold, completion percentage drops off. That kind of interception rates rise. So that's a concern there. I think I would throw a dart at Allen Robinson, who we talked about. I think I'm intrigued to see where these running backs go. I think that's gonna determine a lot about this. If one of these running back needy teams doesn't take one, there may be some sleepers in there like a Justin Forsett hiding on one of these rosters. So that's something we'll have to talk about later in the summer. And tight end Austin Seferian-Jenkins, I think there's a long tier from like 13 to 27 in that number 2 tight end range. I think that there's some values to be had in that tier. I think Seferian-Jenkins kind of paces that group. I think there's a ton of ability there. And I mentioned, Hill's in that group. Morrow's in there. Tyler Eifert's coming back. I don't love Eric Ebron, but, like it or not, he fits in there as well, just from volume alone. So that second tier of tight ends, I think we're going to find, 1 or 2 guys that really emerges from there.
Yeah, I'm not as terribly as excited about Ebron, but as a Lions fan, I hope he hits it this year. Mr. Michael Clay, again, at Mike Clay NFL for Twitter. You can find him at Pro Football Focus. You can find him at ESPN Insider. Sir, I thank you for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
Hey, anytime. We'll do it again at closer to the season.
That sounds good, Mike. Once again, guys, thanks for dropping by. I'm PyromaniacMo. You can find me at PyromaniacMo. The Pyromaniac.com. We're always putting out new stuff. We got a podcast about the top 70 wide receivers right now. We are constantly working on our updates for the draft kit. As I said, 22 tabs as of right now. I'm working on my tiers for volume 2. Pick us up on iTunes for the podcast. Do us a favor, do a 5-star rating for Pyromaniac Fantasy Football Fire podcast. We certainly would appreciate it. Help move us up as we spread the fantasy goo. You can help us out a bit too. Thank you much, guys. Till next time.